for tuning in. I'm Jessica, and today I am going to show you how I made this Cinderella magical pumpkin transforming into a carriage. So I'm starting off here with 2 bundt cakes. They'll give me a really good head start for that pumpkin shape, and then I'm just using buttercream to start stacking the cakes onto my armature. It's not 100% necessary to use an armature, you can just put it straight onto a board, but I knew I wanted to have a little bit of a gap underneath to create the feeling that the pumpkin was sort of floating magically and having this moment of turning into the carriage. I've measured my doweling rod by pushing it into the cake and cutting it just short of the height of the top of that first layer of cake, and I'm just using the other pieces of doweling which I've cut to the same length to push the previous piece right through the cake down to the board. The reason I want to cut the doweling just short of the height of that cake layer is because if I cut them slightly too long, I'm going to create a gap between the cake layers. I don't want that, I want them to be very closely packed together. So these dowels will be holding up this board and the next layer of cake, and that will stop the layer of cake underneath from getting squashed down with the weight from the next layer. Because once you've got that layer on and all the ganache and the icing, it can start to push down. It becomes incredibly heavy and you need that support to keep the whole cake together. We don't want any bagging icing, any leaning or bulges or anything like that. Just using some scraps that I cut off earlier and a spare buttercream just to push right up against that central dowel and keep the cake steady. Just using a serrated knife to create some nice indentations all the way around the cake. I'm going to be making indentations on the top and from the bottom. It's quite tricky because it is a rounded shape and I had to do it in pieces, but we want to get this looking more like that Cinderella pumpkin shape that we all know and recognise. At this point, because of the nature of this cake, it is a natural kind of object that I'm making. I'm not going to spend ages carving the cake and getting it exactly the shape I want it. I've still got my ganache layer and my fondant layer to go, and each time with each layer I will build up and make it more and more like the shape that I want it to be. So it's just quite a rough foundation and then slowly building on that. I'm using ganache rather than buttercream because I find it gives a really good foundation for the fondant, and also it sets much firmer, so you'll find that your cake stability is so much better than it would be with buttercream. Once I have the cake covered, I use a palette knife and some hot water just to go over and start smoothing down and getting more of the shape that I want. But again, at this point it doesn't matter if it's not perfect. Looking at the shape, I wasn't 100% happy with it. So I decided to use some fondant to build out around the outside edge to make it more of that rounded, cute little pumpkin shape. And at last we get to the exciting bit. Once I've covered the cake in fondant, that is when I start to get excited because I can decorate it and make it look amazing. one of my favourite top tips. Use an acupuncture needle to take out your air bubbles. They're so much finer than a normal needle or a cocktail stick or anything like that. You will not see any marks. I just bought them online. They're really inexpensive. They cost £1 or £2 and you get about 100 for that. For any kind of spherical shaped cake like this, you need to use a really good quality fondant with lots of stretch in it. So I'm using Massatercino sugar paste. I'm starting to smooth the fondant down onto the cake, and at the same time push into where the indentations are. I'm trying not to create air bubbles as I go, and I'm just carefully lifting up the folds at the bottom of the fondant and pushing down using the palm of my hand to get that fondant wrapped and stretched right the way under. You'll see that the fondant actually stretches as I push under, and it will get longer. So you need to make sure when you roll out the fondant that you roll it quite thick. At this point, I'm just using my fingers to really push the icing into where the indentations are underneath and making sure there's no air bubbles there, really smoothing it down to get that shape through from the ganache layer. I'm going to use this real pumpkin as my reference. Even though I don't want this pumpkin to look 100% real, I want it to have a sort of stylized, slightly exaggerated look. I need something just to get that character, something to look at and get ideas for where I'm going to put the marks and what kind of textures I'm going to make. You don't necessarily have to use a real pumpkin. I tend to work in more of an illustrative than realistic way, so quite often I'll just get a few images up that I like from Google and use those as my reference point. I'm just going to take my time now to work all the way around the pumpkin, making sure I get every detail in now. I don't want to come back to it later when the fondant has set and try and work on it then. It will all start to crack. So now, while it's soft, is the time to get those marks in. Unfortunately, my camera didn't really pick up all the marks I've made. You can only see the really deep ones, but they are there. But now I'm going to move on to the more exciting part of adding embellishments onto the cake. I have two cutters here which I'm carefully going to space out on some greaseproof paper and draw around them, and this is going to be my guide for the vines which are going to be turning into the wheels of the carriage. I've carefully checked the measurements against the cake so I know that they're going to fit. And yes, it was an edible ink pen, not a felt pen, don't go nuts at me. So here I'm having to work quite quickly because I'm using pastillage to make this part of the cake. Obviously not as quickly as the film is showing, but I had to work quite quickly anyway. And the reason why is because this stuff does tend to dry out very, very quickly. It hardens very quickly, but it will harden much stronger than your regular gum paste or fondant, and that's why I'm using it, because this is going to be quite a delicate structure. And I am not the best at working with wire with fondant over the top, so I prefer just to make it out of this and hope for the best. So we'll see what happens later. The cocktail sticks here were an ingenious plan for how I was going to attach these onto the main part of the cake. It didn't exactly go to plan. I'll show you later in the video. Unfortunately, I did lose a little bit of footage, but I made the stalk using some fondant mixed with CMC powder and just literally twisting a piece around again and again until I got the shape. The needles are there just to support it while it dries, and yes, the top two ones I didn't need, that's because I kept moving it. And then adding some extra marks using my Dresden tool. This piece of fondant is going to be used to cover the board. That's why there's a slit cut into it, because I'm going to wrap it around the armature of the cake. As you can see, this fondant is amazing. Look, it doesn't even tear one little bit. I'm just going to move it about and stretch it around and get it right over that board. There is going to be a lump in the middle there where I added extra support, but that really doesn't matter because I already know that I'm going to cover that. I'm going to be decorating the board with leaves and embellishments, so you're not going to see any of that at all. Yes, so here we have my guilty confession. It did actually break. The main part of it has actually held quite well, and I'm just using some glue to attach it onto the cake, and the board is still quite wet, so I'm able to push that into the board with glue and that should stay. I'm pretty sure my ingenious cocktail stick idea weakened it, so if I was going to make this again, I'd make these in all one piece and I would stick them on with royal icing and stop trying to be so darn clever. It's really important, just don't panic if something does break or crack in the middle of making a cake. You're working with really fragile materials, so it does happen. Just don't panic, there's always ways around it and ways to fix it. And no, they are not pumpkin leaf cutters, those are grapevine cutters, because I'm probably never going to use pumpkin cutters again, so I'm just going to use what I have got. And as I said before, I'm not trying to make it 100% realistic. These are so close to what a pumpkin leaf looks like anyway, and I am making a stylized version of one, so this is a suggestion of a pumpkin leaf. And I think it turns out quite well. I was really pleased with it. And again, that is not a leaf veiner, it is a petal veiner, as you've probably guessed. I just really liked the texture it gave. I'm not going to roll out the gum paste too thin at this point because I'm using that silicone mould. You can see that the marks in it are quite deep, so if I push it into that with really thin gum paste, it's just going to tear. Here I'm just working my way all the way around the edge with the ball tool, thinning out the edges of the leaf. And then I'm going to take the leaf over to the mould and apply firm but gentle pressure just to get all those marks in there. Look at that, lovely. And then of course the classic Dresden tool. How much do you love one of these? I don't think I've used any tool more than that one, just to add a few more marks. And of course straight over to my greengrocer's apple tray. You can pick these up from your local greengrocer if you have one, if it's still open and not closed down. But if you have, you can go and get one, go in there and ask, they'll give you one for free. I've waited till the leaves are not quite fully dry when I'm sticking them on with edible glue, and this is because I need to be able to slightly mould them to the shape of the cake. I want them slightly malleable so they'll stick exactly how I want them to. At this point, I felt the cake just needed something a little extra, so I decided some little mini roses would look really pretty. I've used a 5-petal cutter in a very small size, and I've just used the ball tool to thin those out, and I'm just wrapping them around this previously prepared cocktail stick with the centre of the flower already hardened on there, and I just literally wrap them around, overlapping each one, and then add on the next one. I'm going to stick these straight onto the cake because they're so tiny. It doesn't really matter. I don't really need to leave them to dry for ages. Obviously, if you're adding large roses, you will need to leave those to dry and harden for a while, otherwise they're just going to start falling apart on the cake. For this part, I would recommend you use tweezers, not scissors, just in case you damage anything. I just couldn't find mine anywhere. Using a limited colour palette, I'm going to add the tiniest amount of colour on at a time. I don't want to overcolour this cake. I want to make it really light, pretty and magical looking. This is of course just personal preference for this particular cake, that's what I wanted, but if you wanted to add brighter colours or just more colour, that would be totally up to you. And I did have a little bit of a problem with that curl there, but not to worry, I'll just sort that out later. And I'm just adding a little colour to the board as well, just to give it more depth and more interest, and a background for the mice I'm going to put on. Using a food safe gold mixed with vodka. I actually use vodka rather than Rejuvenator, it's a lot cheaper, and don't worry, all alcohol evaporates, so there's nothing left on there, and I'm using that to highlight the stalk and some of the tendrils. And at last it's time to put my little mice on the board and really bring the cake alive. If you have any questions at all to do with this cake, or any suggestions for tutorials you would like to see, or anything I didn't cover in this tutorial, please do drop your comments and suggestions in the box below. I'd be more than happy to hear from you and answer any questions I can. Thank you so much for watching. Do remember to hit the like, subscribe and notification bell so you can be informed when my next tutorial comes out. Thank you.